G'day, I'm Mezgike. Today we're going to paint a Plague Marine together. He's going to be grim dark and he's going to have a radioactive glowing plasma gun. I've blue tacked this guy onto a block of wood, making it easier to hold onto him, and I've separated him into two subsections, making it easier to paint his chest and the plasma gun. Before we can rip into painting him, we've got to prime him, and we're going to use Chaos Black Spray for this, and we're not going to over prime him, we're going to just make him slightly speckly so that the paint sticks nicely. Let's begin part 1, blocking in. We're going to start off with Steel Legion Drab here, using a large base brush, and we're going to thin that paint right down with some water so that it's nice and runny and flows nice and smoothly into the gaps and doesn't leave any brush strokes or clog up any detail or anything like that. We're just going to get it nice and smooth and start slapping it all over the model. And we could use an airbrush for this, and a lot of the time I do, but just for this video I wanted to try using the large base brush. I hadn't used it before, I just wanted to give it a try, and it really does work pretty well. As I said before, you just need to make sure that the paint is very thin. You can see here just how thin the first coat is, and that's fine, not to worry. We're going to do 2 more coats of this. A total of 3 coats will be plenty for this paint. Next up, we're using Leadbelcher to paint all of the metal areas, and this includes anything like the trim and the spikes and studs, sort of like chains and weapons, parts of the plasma gun. Don't worry about those little rivets for now, we'll get to those later. Also, don't worry too much about being neat here. Don't be too messy and going silly with it, but we're going to do a touch-up stage later on, so if you're being too neat at this stage, it'll just slow you down a little bit. So at this stage we're just focusing on getting the paint on there quite quickly, because this is really it's a pretty boring stage, so we're just blocking in all the colors. There's not rocket science here. We just got to get the paint down so we can do the interesting stuff later. I always make the shoulder pad trim of my Plague Marines Leadbelcher. I wouldn't do it gold or anything like that. I just think that would just draw too much attention. So especially around the head and the top of the model, you don't want to be taking focus away from the face. So make sure you don't do these bits gold. Have a go at this. You can see how runny the paint is there, how thin I've done it. And that's fine. I'm not even worried about it. It just means I just got to do a couple of extra coats, and it's just not going to clog up any detail. It's just that's a plus in my book. Make sure you paint the pipes on the inside there where there's tears going through the rubber. Righto, let's move on to Abaddon Black and paint all of the rubber pipes. So we've painted the other pipes, the exposed pipes, we painted those Leadbelcher, but these ones we want to have kind of a rubber casing around it. We're going to whack a good coat of Abaddon Black on those. Also, we're going to paint the joints in between the armor. They get a good coat of Abaddon Black, as well as these little vent thingies on the back of his calves here. I'm not sure what those are supposed to do. I assume maybe they're supposed to let off some stink. And finally, we're going to paint this gun case black too. Make sure, as with all of the other colors, we've thinned this down with some water so we don't clog up any detail, and also leave brush strokes all over the place. That wouldn't look very good. We're going to hook into some Zandri Dust now, and we're going to lay down a foundation over all of the bones and the skulls and the horns. You can see also that I've sort of converted this model to be standing on a pile of skulls, and that was really easy. All you do is tilt the model back on his hind leg and wedge a little bit of green stuff or some kind of other putty into that foot so that his front leg is sort of aiming up to the sky a little bit, and then you just get a bunch of skulls and wedge it underneath that foot and place them together so that they look pretty good. And then you can use I used Games Workshop Citadel texture paint and just filled it in between some of the bones so that you didn't have big ugly gaps and things like that. And then that can be painted to look like rubble or little pieces of bone, and it just helps to create a bit more of a nice kind of arrangement of skulls, like a flower arrangement. And so yeah, we're just painting the horns with Zandri Dust, putting down nice solid base coat for later. And the next colour that we're going to use for the blocking in stage is Celestra Grey. And we're going to use this to paint all of the cloth or the skin. That includes his face as well as his little friend hanging off his belt there. We'll call him Frank. So paint Frank. And you'll see later on that even though we're basing both the skin and the cloth with Celestra Grey, they're going to look very different from each other. And this is because Celestra Grey is a really good paint. You can really manipulate it by changing the color properties with some washes and glazes and things like that. And he's looking a bit like a ghost at the moment, but he's going to look pretty good soon. Now we're going to block in all of the gold areas, and we're going to crack out Blighted Gold for this. And like I said before, when we were doing the Leadbelcher, we want to keep the gold areas to a minimum. So just keep it for things like little icons, like the little fly icons, these little cylindrical things, this little generator thing, whatever it is. Just little small things like that. Don't go overboard with the gold. Definitely don't be painting trim and stuff like that. Here we're just doing a quick touch up before we move on to part 2. So like I said before, you can just kind of knock out those blocking in colors, get them done quick, and now we're just going over and neatening them up. So I'm using Leadbelcher here to just neaten up a little bit of Celestra Grey that got on the trim around his collar. Here I'm going to use some Steel Legion drab to just fix up some bits on the armor where I got some Leadbelcher. So he's going to look nice and neat for stage 2 in a minute. And I find it much better to have a quick touch up before we can move on to each new part, just to tidy up our little mistakes. Next, it's time to pull all of these colors together by basically drowning the model in Agrax Earthshade. Every element of him is going to get a coat of this, except for the Celestra Grey areas. Just even the black, man, just whack it all over everything. Just get a nice solid coat of Agrax Earthshade over the whole model. And the main purpose of this Agrax Earthshade is to basically define where the detail is. As you'll see later, we're going to be putting a lot of different colors over this model. A lot of colors are going to go over the different elements throughout different stages of the whole painting process. And this Agrax Earthshade pretty much just tells us where that detail is, as well as giving all of the colors something in common with each other. Agrax Earthshade is just also, it just instantly makes things look better. It's just awesome. Like if you put this straight over Leadbelcher, you could almost just leave it there like that. It's just awesome. The time has come. Let's paint the armor. We're going to start off with 1 or 2 panels only, and we're going to use Rhinox hide, and we're going to thin it right down with water, like really thin, man. Just thin it so that it's basically water with not much paint in it at all. And then what we're going to do is we're going to load up the brush with it and wipe it off onto a tissue so that the brush is not dripping with water. As you can see here, I'm not flooding the model with it. I'm just controlling it with a small amount of water on the brush. And this is glazing. This is what we're doing is we're creating a gradient. And as you can see, I started up at the top of this panel, and I've worked my way to the bottom left. So it's worth mentioning, at this point I usually imagine a light source, and for most of my models, for whatever reason, I imagine that light source is coming from the top right hand corner of the model. That'll keep things consistent as we work around the entire model here, going from panel to panel. So the basic concept of what we're doing here is we're glazing towards the darkest corner where we want the paint to be thickest, which is the bottom left in this case, because each panel is going to be lighter at the top right and darker at the bottom left. That means that we want more Rhinox hide at the bottom left than we do at the top right, and progressively more. Like we keep getting more and more and more towards the bottom left until it's nice and dark and we've got a good solid coat of Rhinox hide. And a good way of making sure that you've got the right consistency, the right water to paint ratio, is when you drag the brush onto the model, the paint should dry very very quickly. Like in a few seconds it should be dry. So if it's taking ages to dry and it's just soaked and it's basically like a wash, then you've got too much paint on the brush, and what you need to do is lightly dab it on or twist it onto a piece of tissue, and that will absorb some of the water from the brush. So remember, make sure when the brush drags across the model, it should only take a few seconds for that paint to dry. And so that way you can focus on 1 or 2 panels at a time and keep building up those layers before moving on to more panels. And now we're going to do exactly the same process using Steel Legion drab, but we're going to focus this into the opposite corner. So we're going towards the top right hand corner of each panel. And this is going to just push the gradient effect that we're going a little bit more and brighten up those top right hand corners. And you can see I'm not using any kind of fancy brush for this stuff. At this point, it's just a medium layer brush, I think, or base brush. I'm not really even sure. Just something that's got a good body that can hold a decent amount of watery paint. You can see how handy it is by putting this subsection here onto a piece of wire, and that wire is just drilled into a base, and that base is blue tacked onto a block of wood. So I can hold onto that block of wood and this little piece of wire, and I don't need to buy any kind of fancy model miniature holder or whatever. Just some wood, mate. Just stick it on some wood. All I've done is just sanded the edges of the block so that it's comfortable to hold. And then, as you can see, the base the subsection is attached to the base, and that's just blue tacked on there. Same with this fella. I can just hold onto this block of wood and I don't ever touch the model. Time to switch it up here and bring out your fine brush. I'm using a Winsor & Newton Series 7 brush. What is it? 00 or something. And we're going to use some Kislev Flesh now. We're going to start edge highlighting all of the panels now. But we're mostly focusing towards the top right hand corner of each panel with this. And again, it's very watery, so you can sort of glaze it. We're not just fully painting the edges. You can see on my thumb there how it's quite translucent. We're not just getting it out of the pot and painting an edge highlight. So we're still sort of glazing. When the paint's this runny, you can work with it a bit. And also notice these little studs that are poking out of his armor. If you highlight underneath them, it gives it a bit more of a 3D feel. So it looks like those studs have been punched through the armor rather than just magically sitting on top of the armor. It just little details like that, man. It just helps to make the model just bang, just be awesome, So we're just working our way around from panel to panel, just popping out these edges. And you can see when I make a mistake there, I just lightly dab it with my finger and have another go at it. And that actually sometimes looks really good. Like it can help to get a bit of a gradient when you wipe the first thick coat off and then you put a thinner coat over it closer to the edge. You get a little bit of a transition. Make sure you paint the edges around his little stink vents. That just helps those to pop out. Look, see how it makes it look 3D, more 3D, and they're coming out of the armor now. They're not just sitting on top of the armor. And there are a few little weird mold lines and areas around these parts of the legs where, since it's plastic, the mold can't. It rounds off, or whatever. It rounds off, and the detail just flattens out. So those little bits can sometimes look pretty dodgy. And when you just highlight those edges, you just make up the detail with paint. And so make sure you highlight the knuckles and the fingertips as well on parts like this. And you can see that we've got a bit of a gradient happening on each panel, framed with the Kislev Flesh highlight. It's popping, starting to come alive now. Got a fair bit to go though. Let's get out the old Nuln Oil, and we're going to glaze over each panel in a way very similar to how we glazed with Rhinox hide. Only this time we can be much freer with it. We don't have to be too careful with it. It's kind of in between a wash and a glaze. So we're going to work our way around each panel and always painting towards where we want the paint to be strongest, because remember that the last place your brush leaves the model, it will always leave a sort of little puddle. That's just where the paint will collect, and it will always be slightly stronger there. So always paint towards where you want the color to be strongest. So in this case, it's towards the bottom left. So you can see I'm trying to just direct the paint towards the bottom left there. But again, with this stage with the Nuln Oil, you don't have to be too careful with it. The main purpose of this stage is to darken the armor up a little bit, as well as pull the highlights together. Pull all those the three colors that we've used so far: the Steel Legion drab with Rhinox hide and then Kislev Flesh. We're pulling all those together and giving them something in common with each other. And feel free at this stage to get some of that Nuln Oil all over the metal areas. You'll see later on that it will give a lot of interest to the metal areas. We're going to spill even Rhinox hide. If you spill a bit of that Rhinox hide onto the metals and then some of this Nuln Oil, you'll see that it's going to give that metal a lot of character later on. So we're just working our way around the armor, darkening it up, making it nice and grim and dark. You see we're focusing it there on the left side of that panel. And we're getting good contrast where the dark side meets the light side of the panel next to it. That's what it's all about. Darkening those corners up. Let's have a word about this section up here, the top of the model. This is the focus, his face and the top of his chest. I'm an illustrator, and when I'm drawing a model, I always try to keep the bottom of the model darker than the top. So I'm putting that into practice with this model here. I'm darkening the bottom of the model, or all around his legs. Look at this. I'm basically dry brushing this Nuln Oil. Nuln Oil is a wash, and I'm fully dry brushing it here, just slapping it all over the bottom of the model and trying to create a bit of a feathering effect. And you can see now that the bottom of the model is quite a bit darker than the top of the model, leading your eye straight towards his pretty face. One of my favorite Citadel paints, Drakenhof Nightshade. Let's get it out. And we'll begin painting it in pretty much the same way as the Nuln Oil. Where the purpose of Nuln Oil was to darken the model and make him grim dark, the purpose of the Drakenhof Nightshade is to change the color properties to a more of a blue hue. So you can see the armor is quite warm, with Rhinox hide and the Steel Legion drab being quite warm colors. The Drakenhof Nightshade is actually going to cool the model right down. Have a look at his chest there. You can see how it's becoming slightly blue, just very slightly blue, and we're looking a bit colder now and a bit scarier, not so warm and friendly. We're just focusing this into all the shadows, and feel free to tint the highlights as well. This Drakenhof Nightshade is going to help pull all the colors together and make them have a blue color in common with each other. So we're always going towards the shadow with this. And we will get 2 coats of this over the armor. And possibly maybe like 2.5 coats at the bottom when we're focusing on his legs to darken up those areas again. Let's just go ahead and spill some of this Drakenhof Nightshade all over the metal, as we did with the Nuln Oil. You'll find that Drakenhof Nightshade gives metal a really oily look, like because it's kind of blue. It looks sort of like motor oil. And notice with this shoulder pad, I don't get so much Drakenhof Nightshade trim. It just makes both of those shoulder pads just slightly different to each other. And have a look, you can see that his armor has been cooled right down. It's got a bit of blue all over it, and it's looking nice and cold and dark. We're getting back into some highlighting now with Ulthuan Grey. This is a very light bluish grey colour that we're going to use to highlight the edges in what I would call the cold corners of each panel. We're going to try and enhance the contrast here. We're going to have a very cold left hand corner and a slightly warm upper right corner of each panel. So to highlight the cold corners, we're using Ulthuan Grey because it's got quite a blue cold color to it. So it's going to be, we're going to use it nice and thin, and we're going to just in a similar way to how we highlighted with Kislev Flesh earlier. We're just going to focus this color in the bottom left corner of each panel. Some of the edges you can kind of stipple like this. We don't want to make each edge really smooth. So by stippling it like this, it makes each edge look really bumpy and rough and battle damaged. And we're gonna just put the odd scratch here and there in the armor. And you can see we're working our way around the back areas of the armor here, the cold areas, and it's looking kind of battle damaged, because we're not doing heaps thin lines, you know, like this isn't a ultramarine or whatever. This dude's just been fighting, and we want him to look super battle damaged and hammered, like he's buggered. He needs new parts. So just sort of be rough, be slightly rough when you're highlighting those edges, and it will give loads of character to him. Also, this isn't our neatest highlighting either. Don't worry too much. Give it like 80% of your highlighting ability here. You'll see why later. Pop out the underside of his knuckles here, make them nice and cold. Brighten them up a little bit as well. I even put a little bit on his fingertips here. Just makes them really pop. Cool. So now that we've highlighted the colder areas of the armor, let's go and highlight the warmer areas. And we're going to use Kislev Flesh for this. A nice warm skin tone color. And we're going to focus this in the top right hand corner of each panel, which is exactly the opposite of what we just did. Make sure this is nice and thinned right down with a bit of water. Not too thin, like it's not a full-on glaze, but if you just make it a little bit thinner, it's easier to work with, and you can sort of get a bit of a blend here and there if you need to. Make the edges rough as we did before, so that he looks nice and hammered, not new out of the factory. And these little squares on his belt are a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So the bottom left of each square will be highlighted with the Ulthuan Grey, and the top right hand corner of each square will be highlighted with this Kislev Flesh. And obviously the top of the backpack here we want to be quite warm, so if we're highlighting these bits with Kislev Flesh where the bones have poked through the armor, and since the paint's quite thin, we can sort of do a little bit of a gradient action, directing the paint towards, dragging it towards the edge of each corner there, making a sort of a gradient, just enhancing that effect a little bit more. We're going to highlight around the the pocks and the puncture wounds in his armor. Just dab it if you make a mistake. So now we're going back to Drakenhof Nightshade. And this is one of my processes. You'll see me doing this all the time. We highlight up and then we shade back down. So we've highlighted with Ulthuan Grey and Kislev Flesh, but now I feel like some of those highlights are a little bit stark and they're not quite blending the way I want. So I go back to Drakenhof Nightshade and tone them back down. So this pulls all those colors together nicely. It also gives you a chance to change the color properties of those actual highlights that we just did. So we want those edge highlights, those Ulthuan highlights, to be nice and blue in the corner. We want those to be cold. So by tinting them with the Drakenhof Nightshade, or glazing them really, we're cooling them right down. And now I'm going back to Kislev Flesh again to just pop out some of those highlights that I want to really be really bright. So that's my process of, I go back and forth. I sometimes do this 4 or 5 times, 5, 6 even times, just until I get the right effect. You highlight it up and then you tone it back down, glaze it back down. And it pulls all those colors together, and like I keep saying, gives them all something in common with each other. So we're using Kislev Flesh here, just in the very tops of the highlights where we want it to be just a little bit of a pop. And this is our neatest highlighting here. We want to try and get this as neat as we can and very sharp. I would use the Kislev Flesh at this point to highlight any little scratches or any kind of corner of the armor or anything like that I just really want to distinguish. Fingertips like this, knuckles, the edges of the pock marks or the dents in the armor. And so guess what? We're finished the armor now. You can see all of the different colors we've put into it. We've got Steel Legion Drab and Rhinox Hide, highlighted with Kislev Flesh and Ulthuan Grey, and then all pulled together with a blue wash. And it's a very grim, dark look. Right, let's learn to paint the stinkiest and yuckiest and mankiest rotting bones you've ever seen. We're going to first use Ungor Flesh, and we're going to layer over the Zandri Dust and Agrax Earthshade layers that we did earlier. And we're just going to thin this right down with water and just start layering it up. Make it nice and thin so that you don't clog up any detail or leave any brush strokes. And we're not using any kind of fancy brush for this, just a medium layer brush or something similar. And we're just focusing on just getting that coat of paint down as quickly as possible, and without getting any on the nice armor that we just finished painting. We're going to rip into it, but we're going to control ourselves so that we don't get any paint on that armor, because that would just be a nightmare to have to try and touch that up. So we're just doing 2 or 3 coats of this, and I'm not even too worried about getting it right on the tips of each horn. But you want to definitely get a good solid coat of this for the bottom 2/3 of each horn at least. We got lots of really cool colors coming up that we're going to build up the horns and the skulls, make them look nice and manky as. So we've done 2 or 3 coats of this and we're ready to move on to the next step. We're going to crack out the Zamesi Desert and we're going to thin this right down with water, much the same as we did with the Rhinox hide when we were doing the armor earlier. So we're going to thin it right down. It's probably about 90% water and 10% paint, maybe even less. I don't even know, man. Just heaps thin. Just make it really thin, like it's mostly water. And then we're going to load up the brush and then twist the brush onto a piece of tissue so that the tissue soaks up that water so that your brush is not dripping. So when the brush touches the model, we don't want paint to just flood out all over the place. So let's focus this paint towards the shadows of each bone and skull. Remember that our light source for this model is coming from the top right hand corner, so that we're gonna direct this paint, this is the Zamesi Desert, to the bottom left of each element. So the bottom left of each skull forehead and under each cheekbone, etc. For the horns, we're just directing it towards the tip of each horn so that each horn gets darker towards the tip. We want a nice solid coat of Zamesi Desert at the end of each horn. That's why I wasn't too worried about painting the Ungor Flesh right towards the tip, because we're going to layer this up, man, with heaps of paints. It's going to get darker and darker. Check it out. So the horns are looking a much more yellow color now. Now let's rip out the Mornfang Brown and do exactly the same thing, except this time we're getting a little bit closer towards the end of each horn. So we're going to get darker and darker towards the tip. And we're using Mornfang Brown here because we want to introduce some red to this horn. Later on, we're going to add lots of red, orange rust to this model, and we're putting some red into the horns to relate the horns to the rust. It's also it's also a good idea to think about when you're painting your bones and your skulls and your horns. You know, they don't just need to be bone color, man. Like you can start off with a bone color, but then you can start blending in some interesting colors to it. You got to think about what the model needs. What colors can you add to the model to relate to other elements, etc. Like you could add a green color to the horns. We could be using something like Athonian Camoshade right now and making our skulls and our bones sickly green color. We're going to do green plasma later on though, so I didn't want to clash with that. I wanted to just pick a small element like the rust, the red rust, and relate the bones to the rust. And now we're just going to, we're darkening up those tips, the tips of the horns. We're going to use Rhinox hide. Again, it's thinned right down with water. Exactly the same as how we've been doing, just getting closer and closer towards the tip. You can see here I make a mistake. I put a little bit too much on and I just dab it with my finger and I carry on with my life and everything's all good and we've got a nice gradient happening. And we're just moving on to the next horn and just getting closer and closer to each tip. By the time I'm finished the set of 5 horns, I can start again on the next horn, getting a little bit closer and closer, and the paint's already dry. You've got to remember that the paint on the brush is full of water, so it's very easy to have too much water on the brush. You need to make sure that you twist it onto a tissue so that the tissue absorbs that water, and that when the brush drags across the model, it should dry only a few seconds later. That's when you know you've got it right. When you're doing this here and it's dry a couple of seconds later. We're just focusing some of this Rhinox hide in towards the bottom crease of the forehead of the skulls there. And we just also want to we want to focus this towards where each skull meets the base, just because later the base is going to be a muddy color, so we want to just start that transition of skulls coming out of the base there. So you can see our transitions starting to come to life. The next step is Abaddon Black. In exactly the same way, we're gonna thin it down and just move a little bit closer towards the tip of each horn, always painting towards where we want the paint to be strongest. Because remember that when the brush leaves the model, in that place where the brush leaves the model, it will always leave a slight puddle where the paint is a little bit stronger. Just be nice and subtle here when we're painting some Abaddon Black on the skulls. We don't want to overdo it with this color. Just a little bit on the bottom crease of each forehead. Put a little bit into the cracks here and the eye sockets. And since this is quite runny, you can kind of direct it into the teeth and the nose like you would a wash. And always remember, use your thumb to control the paint. I often just wipe a little bit onto the thumb there, or just give the brush a little bit of a twist if it's getting a bit hairy and funky, just to straighten it up a little bit. Let's get into some Screaming Skull here, and this has been thinned right down with water, so we're glazing it. We're not edge highlighting this here. We're glazing it just in the same way that we've been doing the rest of the horns. Only this time we're going in the opposite direction towards where our light source is. So that's right up there in the top right hand corner, isn't it? So we're going that way, making it a little bit more of a bone color. It was getting a little bit yellowy, so the Screaming Skull is just toning it down a little bit. So we want our bones to be colored, but not too crazy, especially on the skulls. So now I've toned that paint down a little bit, got some of the water out of it. It's a little bit thicker, and now I'm doing a little bit more focused highlighting, not glazing so much, just focusing it towards the tips, the tops of the skulls, and the underside of these scratches here, the underside of the eye sockets. Just controlling it a little bit there with my thumb, twisting the brush, making it sharp. Just picking out these little highlights. Glazing it a little bit there. And here we're just brightening up just those bottoms of each horn. You can see it just pops it out, just makes it a little bit brighter right at the base. And the reason I paint my horns lighter at the base and darker at the tip is for a very, very special reason. I'm always trying to direct your attention towards the center of the model, or towards the focus, in which case it's the face. Imagine if each of these horns was lighter at the tip and darker at the base. Your eyes are going to naturally follow the horns outwards towards where the horns are brightest. So your eyes aren't really going to know where to look. But if you can make those horns lighter at the base and darker at the tip, your eye's going to follow those horns down towards where it's getting lighter and lighter, and then bam, all of a sudden you're looking at his face. And if you can achieve that, then you're just a winner. So we're using Rhinox hide here, and we're just painting a few little nooks and scratches in these horns. We've got these mad gradients, this crazy transition. We're just pulling it together here with a little bit of an effect that's applied all over it, and adding scratches. Screaming Skull, let's do it. We're highlighting the skulls here on the cheekbones, Just enhancing all of those little highlights in the bone areas. Make sure you thin your paint down a little bit for this, but not too much. We're not interested in the paint dribbling out all over the place. We're just thinning it a little bit so that it flows smoothly off the brush. Now we're just going to highlight on the underside of each little scratch that we just painted, and each little dent or little pock mark in the bones, whatever. These scratches, the scratches on the horns, we're going to paint on the underside of them because that's where the light hits. If you imagine a scratch and the light's coming from above, the light is not going to hit on the top edge of that scratch. It's going to accentuate on the bottom edge. Now we're going to start highlighting up the edges of the horns. These sculpts, they're pretty defined. They have pretty sharp edges. We're going to just pop those out. The other thing we're doing is we're using some Screaming Skull to highlight the tips of these horns. And you can see that it just defines where the horns end. Because they're black, it makes it hard to see where they end sometimes. They can get quite lost. Like if they're on a black background or something and they're just in some dark environment, it makes it hard to see where the horns end. Anyway, now you can see them and the horns are finished. Part 4, cloth. Let's just start off with some Abaddon Black, and we're just going to sort of flood this into all the little holes in the cloth. Just neaten that up, darken up those areas. Also, while we've got it out, let's why not just paint his goggles on his face, just so we don't have to do that later. Just pick those out with some Abaddon Black. And also on his little friend Frank, we're gonna paint the don't forget to paint those little stitches in his eyes with black, which I did forget. Now we're moving over to Celestra Grey, and we're just neatening up this cloth. It got pretty filthy with all of the different washes, the Agrax, the Nuln, Rhinox hide, all that. It got all pretty dirty, so we're just neatening that up, and we're gonna do the same thing for the skin areas. Just Celestra Grey, just nice and thin. Let's get it all nice and cleaned up. Ready for some washes. Right, let's use some Reikland Fleshshade, and we're just gonna slap this all over the cloth. Just using this to tint that Celestra Grey. Celestra Grey is such a good color. I use it all the time as a base, and then I just change the color of it with some washes. That's what we're doing here. Now we're going to define the shadows of this cloth. We're going to use some Rhinox hide, and we're going to thin it right down with water, as we have for the rest of the miniature. And remembering that the light source is on the right, we're going to start creating a bit of a gradient transition on the left side of each fold in the cloth. Just like when we were creating the gradients on the armor, just start off painting one part of the cloth, and then just gradually move closer and closer towards the center of the cloth until it gets a little bit darker and a little bit darker. And when you're happy with it, we can move on. It should look a little bit like this. Next we'll hook into some Rakarth Flesh to do exactly the same thing. However, we're going in the opposite direction, and we're just enhancing the highlights of the gradient. Just getting that gradient effect, always chasing that gradient effect. Nice smooth blends. This is how you do it. Thin layers and just patience. Just going over it, over it and over and over it until it looks good. If you ever put too much or it sort of floods into the gaps or whatever, just switch back to the Rhinox hide and just tidy it up a little bit. Back and forth, always. Now we're going to use Screaming Skull in the same way. We're just further pushing those highlights. Just getting towards the tops of each fold, and if you can, trying to push it to the right side of each fold because the light is coming from the right. So we've done Celestra Grey, then Reikland Fleshshade, then Rhinox Hide, and then we started building up the layers with Rakarth Flesh, and now Screaming Skull. It's starting to come alive. However, at this point, I felt that the cloth was a little bit pink. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the colors of it, just like we did with the Drakenhof Nightshade on the armor. We're going to use Seraphim Sepia here, and we're just going to make that cloth look a little bit more of a yellow color. We're just going to tie that in with the horns a little bit. I didn't want to have a pink colored cloth because there's no pink on the rest of this model, and it would just stand out like a sore thumb. So you can see that the cloth relates much better to the horns now. Screaming Skull, we're going to use this to begin building up the edge highlights. And we're just going to start off around, focusing it around each of the little rips and tears in the cloth, as well as the points and the ends of the cloth. And don't forget the bottom hem. That's the line along the bottom of the cloth. That just helps that to just pop out a little bit. Remember that the light would be focused more towards the bottom of each of these rips, more so than the top. And let's also just go and put a few little pops of highlight on the tops of the cloth where it's coming out from underneath the belt. It helps us to know where the cloth begins. And also creates a bit of a nice tuck where it tucks underneath the belt there. And you can see it's very clearly popping out from underneath the belt. We're getting there. What's next? We're going to use some Rhinox hide, and we're just going to create a few little extra bits of detail, some more little scratches, some tiny scratches, in the same way that we did on the horns earlier. Just make sure that these are as random as you can get them. Try not to make them all heading in the same direction. And don't forget the back. Let's get some nice little scratches and tears on there as well. And back to Screaming Skull to highlight underneath each of the scratches, just to pop them out. And for now, the cloth is finished. We will come back to it later though to make it a little bit dirty. Part 5, Skin and Face. Let's rip into it. Athonian Camoshade mixed with Lamian Medium 1:1 or thereabouts, whatever, I'm not too fussed. We're going to use it to paint Frankie and the Plague Marine's face. Make sure when you do this to dip the brush in Lahmian Medium first and then Athonian Camoshade. That way you don't contaminate it and you don't have to wash your brush either. You can just dip it into the Lahmian Medium and then straight into the Athonian Camoshade. Now we're going to use straight up Athonian Camoshade, like straight out of the pot, not thinned down at all. And now we're going to start focusing this into the shadows and creating a bit of a directional light, remembering that the light is coming from the right. So that means we're going to focus more of this towards the left side of his face, the left side of his forehead, the left side of the big folds of cheek flab and blubber. We don't need to be too particular with this. Just a basic general idea that the left side of his face to be slightly darker than the right. Now we're going to switch to our fine brush and we're going to get out the Mornfang Brown and we're going to cut it with water, thin it right down and begin glazing it onto the face. We're going to begin building up our gradients. So focusing it into the shadows, rounding it down over those flabby bits into where the folds are, downwards into where his head is coming out of the armor, underneath on the underside of the cheekbones, around the lips. Just start building up this brown. And don't forget Frankie, we're going to put that around his eyes and his mouth. We're going to put it here where the poor little fella's had his head chopped off with a plague cleaver probably. We're going to direct it into the back of his head. And now we're just going to get out the Rhinox hide and thin it down as well, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're just going to deepen those shadows. We're just going to get into it and create that gradient that we're chasing. Look at each section of his head. Look at this bit here where I'm doing where it's like a boil. We're going to make that into a nice round gradient. This bit over here, the bit around his temple, make a nice smooth gradient where direct that Rhinox hide towards where the pipe is coming out of his head. Each of these lines here in his forehead, creating some forehead wrinkles. The paint is very thin, so it's very transparent, so it's not going to come out like a really stark Rhinox hide line. It's very thin, so you can be quite free with it. We're laying down the colors at this stage. We're not worrying too much about anything really at this point. We're just getting some colors into the face. At this point, you want to go ahead and get your Screaming Skull and just start blocking in those teeth and the maggots. By the way, this face, I sort of chopped his face off and re-sculpted his mouth. I didn't really like his pufferfish style round mouth, that whatever that was before. I don't know what that was about, but anyway, he's got a new mouth now and he's got maggots coming out of it. So we're going to paint those maggots with Screaming Skull too. Now let's switch to Dark Reaper and thin this right down. We're going to glaze this all over the skin. Now Dark Reaper is pretty much, it's a grey, but it's a very blue grey. It's got a lot of blue in it. So we're going to use that to introduce a lot of blue into the skin, and I want to focus it around his mouth. I don't want to put too much of this on the Plague Marine's face. I just want to put it around his mouth so that he's going to have some kind of circulation issue happening here. He's got frostbite in his mouth. Frostbite of the mouth is what he's got, or something unhealthy. So we're just introducing blue. We're introducing colors here. We've got the reds, the browns around his nose and around the sore parts of where the pipe's coming out of his forehead. Now we've got some blue, some pasty greens. And look at this. Now we're going to use Drakenhof Nightshade, and we're just going to enhance that blue around the mouth. Just glazing it, man. Just putting it in the teeth, letting it flood through the teeth, do the work for us. It's like it's going to find the detail in the teeth and create a really dark areas between each teeth. And with Frankie, we're going to put some around his eyes, where the eyes are all stitched up around this bit of his mouth here. And probably going to just put a little bit in the funky bit here, where poor guy's had his head chopped off. Now we're going to tie those colours together with Krieg Kaki. Thin it right down with water and use your fine brush. And we're going to start building up the gradients towards where the highlights are. So we've laid all our colours down. We've basically just blocked in those colours with some glazing. And now we're going to tie it together with some very thin Krieg Kaki to highlight the tips, the edges, the tops of the skin areas. Tops of the cheekbones here. We're going to pick those out. We'll get the tops of the eyebrows. Try and get the top of each line on his forehead so that it gives it more of a 3D look. Even on his nose, because the paint is so thin and it's like a green, we're highlighting over his nose with a green color, even though the nose is brown. But because the paint is so thin and transparent, you can get away with it, and it just ties all of these colors together. It ties the colors of his face together. So we've laid down each color, and now as we have with the rest of the model, we're giving all those colors something in common with each other. You can even stipple, get a bit of a stipple action going here, and what that's going to do is going to give him a bit of an acne look or some kind of different skin complexion. Just gives a bit of texture to him, to his face there. Even like some kind of animal, like an octopus or something. He's got like an octopus skin or whatever. He's just not healthy. Now we're going to use Ulthuan Grey, and you see I've switched to my larger brush. It's thinned right down. All I'm doing is just glazing over that again. Just glazing it down and introducing a little bit of a light blue greyish colour to the highlights here. Just stippling it on, blending it, glazing it, pushing those highlights. Focusing towards the top right hand corner of each part. So here I'm focusing on the top right hand side of his head where the light's coming from. And now I'm just switching to the fine brush and putting a bit more paint in that mix so it's not so watery. And we're going to focus some edge highlights here on the tips of the noses and tips of the eyebrows and the nose and all that. And don't forget to highlight Frankie, his ears and his cheekbones, his nose. Got a little bit too much paint there, so I just lightly dabbed it with my finger. And again, just had a little bit too much paint on the brush at this point. Losing a bit of control there. So I'm just moving to somewhere where I don't mind the highlights to be a bit stronger, like the stretched skin there. And now we're going back to Drakenhof Nightshade to tone down these highlights, as we have been for the rest of the model. So we've been highlighting, and now we're glazing back down. We're toning it back down. We're using Drakenhof Nightshade to introduce some more blue into those highlights around the mouth, which was starting to get a little bit pasty. That can happen when you start going a little bit overboard with the highlighting. it can start looking a little bit pasty and colourless. And we're going back to Ulthuan Grey here to pick out the teeth. It's not easy to do, so just take your time with it and make sure that the paint is thinned with a little bit of water so that it flows nicely, but it doesn't flood into the mouth. Just direct a little bit more Ulthuan Grey onto the highlights again, as we do, going back and forth between highlight and glaze. After painting this little metal bit here, his little mouth gag with Leadbelcher, we're going to give it a coat of Agrax Earthshade. We'll also flood a little bit into his teeth just to darken up those gaps between his teeth. They were a little bit too blue, and it also distinguishes the inside of his mouth from the outside of his mouth, which is very blue. We're also going to put some Agrax Earthshade on the pipe that's poking out of his forehead, out of his temple. Now we're going to switch to Seraphim Sepia and start painting over all of the maggots that are coming out of his mouth there. And don't forget the sneaky little buggers down here, these little hiding ones. Don't forget those. We can also use a little bit of Seraphim Sepia to just pick out some little detail areas on the face and add a little bit more of another color to the face, a little bit more of a yellow, again tying it to the skin and the horns, and later on the rust. So we're just putting this on the little pox, little pimple things, as well as the area at the bottom of his face, darkening the bottom of his face a little bit where his face is poked up through the armor. It just gives us a little insight into what yuckiness is inside the armor too, sort of like some kind of yellow muck or whatever that's rubbed off onto his face as it's come out of the armor there. And for now, the face is finished. Moving into part 6, we're going to begin painting all of the black areas. First up, we're going to use Abaddon Black, and we're going to touch up all of these vents, his stink vents, and these little joints in the armor. Just anything that got a little bit totaled when we were doing all of the armor. And I mean, like, some of this black is no longer black anymore, it's more brown because of all the various contaminations. So then we're going to switch to Dark Reaper and thin it down, not too much, just a little bit. And we're going to begin highlighting the black areas, just sort of lightly layering over each area, leaving Abaddon Black in the gaps. Like these vents here, we're just going to paint the raised areas. And we'll probably do 2 or 3 coats of this, each time getting a little bit more of a gradient happening towards where we want the highlight. You can see the bottom stink vent on his leg there. It's got a little bit of a highlight towards the left side, which is the side where the light is coming from. And when we're doing these pipes here, we want to try and do nice, flowing, smooth brush strokes. If you do short, little, shaggy brush strokes, the black ends up looking a little bit streaky. So try and do nice, smooth ones. And also, when you're highlighting these black areas, try not to overdo it, because if you do too much grey, the black ends up looking grey, not black anymore. So sometimes less is more, and that's the case with painting black, I think. So make sure you pick out these goggles, the black bands around his goggles. As well as the little bit between the 2 lenses. and try and focus the highlight on the top side of this band around his head. We're going to switch over to the gun subsection and begin painting the black gun casing. And we've thinned this down a little bit more here because we want to try and create a little bit more of a gradient towards the top of the gun. So the bottom of the gun will be a little bit darker than the top. These guns have a kind of a wood grain texture. We want to try and stick with that. So on the upper side of each little grain, make the Dark Reaper a little bit stronger, as well as stronger on the top of the gun as a whole. So each little grain here, like this, I'm painting the top side of it. Like so, just in horizontal lines, following the grain. And then directing some paint towards the top of the gun so that we've got a gradient going that way. Ulthuan Grey is up next, and we're going to use this to highlight the black areas. You can see here we're just doing a small line or dot on the side where the light is coming from. Just working our way up the stink vents. Remember to not do too much of a highlight on areas like this, the round pipes. It's very easy to go overboard with that, but just try and control yourself and keep it to a minimum. And you can try and get a little sharp highlight like this, and that just sort of accentuates the shine of the black rubber pipe. Also just directing it here where it comes out of the armor, making it look a bit more 3D. Just picking out the edges here on the goggles, on the upper side of this band that goes around his head. Don't even bother with the bottom. It will just look like a mess. Only the top. You're just going to create a nice little shine in the joints of his armor here. So we're not using Ulthuan Grey to paint the entire ridge here, just a little piece of it, just to create a bit of a shine. And now we're going to highlight the gun case of the plasma gun. Just focusing this Ulthuan Grey on the top side of each grain, running along horizontally. And picking out those edge highlights. Just be patient and just slowly build it up. You can use the edge of the brush here to sort of rub it along the edge, and it makes a nice sharp highlight. Here you can see just how useful it is to have this piece in a subsection. It means we can paint the back of this gun without getting paint all over the armor. Now, as we do, we're going back to Dark Reaper and we're going to glaze down these highlights, tone them down, just bring them back to earth, man. Like, they've gotten a bit out of control here. They're a little bit bright. So Dark Reaper, tone them down, give them a bit more of a blue color. As with the bones, your bones don't have to just be bone color, and black doesn't just have to be black color. You don't just have to highlight black with straight up grey. That's why I've picked Dark Reaper and Ulthuan Grey as my highlights, because they've got blue in them. So you can see that the black just gets a much more interesting color to it. Back to Ulthuan Grey to pop out some of these highlights again. Back and forth, that's what we do. You can go back and forth with this as many times as you want, and the effect's probably just going to get better and better. So if you make a mistake and you reckon you've done a little bit too much of a highlight, just tone it back down, and vice versa. If it's getting a bit dark, you just need to pop it out again with some highlights. And just get to a place where you're happy with it, happy with the result. Part 7, Metal. We're going to start up with Blighted Gold again. We're just going to use this to pick out all of the gold areas and just brighten them up. Again, they've been dulled right down with all of the washes and that we've done, all the Drakenhofs and the Nuln Oils and the Agrax and all that. They've just gotten lost. So we're just going to shine them up again, polish them up with some fresh Blighted Gold, just picking it out on the raised areas. Next up, we're going to use some Sycorax Bronze, and we're just going to use this to brighten up some of those golds, just edge highlight them a little bit. Now we're going to focus on all of the silver areas, the bits that we did Leadbelcher, and some of them are a little bit light. So we're going to use some Nuln Oil here, and we're going to just go over all of the metal, just putting some darkness into it, just wherever you think, not everywhere. Just have a gaze at it, and where you think it needs to be a little bit darker, just put some Nuln Oil in there. Right, now we're using some Typhus Corrosion, and check out my brush. This is my old brush. Never use a good brush for Typhus Corrosion unless you want to kill it and bury it and say goodbye, because if you put a new brush into Typhus Corrosion, it will be full of grit, because this paint has grit all through it, like it's like a texture paint. So please just don't use your good brush. Anyway, so we're using Typhus Corrosion here. We're just wiping most of it off the brush and just sort of stippling it all over the metal, just here and there. Don't worry about going all over the place, just where you think, just adding a little bit of brown to the metal, and also a little bit of texture. And this is the foundation for our rust. We're going to make this metal, like pipes like this, they're going to be rusty as, man. They're going to be feral. They're going to have rust and dirt and grit all over them. And Typhus Corrosion is the way to do that. We're just lightly stippling it on the shoulder pads here, on the trim, but make sure that you don't get this on the armor. If you get it on the armor or anywhere else, just have a brush on standby, just a wet brush, slightly damp, ready to go, ready to just quickly wipe it off before any damage has been done. Just rip into it here, just have some fun. This is a really fun stage. And don't forget as well, the inside of these shoulder pads here, these shoulder pad trims, you can see them when it's on the model. So don't forget those. And also watch out for these little bits of the drips here. Don't get any on them, because we want those to be nice and smooth and shiny later on. mate, this stuff is just brilliant. It's so good. Burnt sienna pigment. It's a Vallejo product. Have a look at it. It's just powder. It's like just powder, man. So we're going to use this straight out of the pot, straight up dry. We're just going to get our brush, dip it in there, just get a little bit on there like that, put it down on your palette, and just lightly stipple it on to the metal areas, much the same as what we did with the Typhus Corrosion. We're just going to selectively place it on the metal, not everywhere, but you'll see that it clings to texture. So it's going to really cling to that Typhus Corrosion. It's going to hang on to it, man. Like, that's one of the main reasons why we did that Typhus Corrosion before. So you can see we're introducing a bit of red, a bit of red to that metal, tying it in with those horns and the bones. I always have a think about this sort of stuff before a drop of paint goes on the model. I think about the different elements of the model and what colors I'm going to paint them. Like, what color is the armor going to be? What color are the horns going to be? How will the horns relate to other parts of the model? So I'm always planning my models before I start painting it, and I think that's really important. That you shouldn't just get your model, get it out of the box, start painting it straight away. I mean, you can if you want, do what you want, but that's not what I do. I think about it even for a couple of days before I start. You got to get your ingredients before you can start cooking, I guess. Anyway, we're using this burnt sienna pigment, dry straight out of the bottle, and just dusting it onto the metal areas. Make sure you don't sneeze or cough on it because it'll blow away. It needs to be sealed later on. Time to go and get your Ryza Rust, and we're going to do something interesting with this. Normally Ryza Rust is a dry paint used for dry brushing, but we're not going to use it for dry brushing. We're going to get it and we're going to thin it with water, and we're going to make it into a wash, and we're going to start selectively applying it to parts of the metal where we want some spot colors of rust, some really intense bright orange rust, where the water would go, probably where you think the rust would be most intense. Down here like this, where, I don't know, I'd imagine water would sit down there, so we're going to get some rust happening there. On the chains, and there's this little spiky thing here, the trim, just adding some interest to the rust and brightening it up a little bit. You can see where the burnt sienna pigment was, it's not a very bright color, it's quite a subtle effect. Now when we're using this Ryza Rust wash, we're enhancing that rust and brightening it all up a bit. You can flood a little bit of it into the creases of the pipes, around some rivets, put some in the little dents and the pock holes in the armor, make some streaks streaking down from out of the rivets, and make sure if you do that you align it with the rivets so it looks like that water is dripping out of the rivets. If you get too much on like this, just you can use your brush to relocate it, soak it up and move it around. Often I'd go over some areas one or two more times just to brighten them up, but not all over the place, because you can overdo it with this, so be careful. And you can see now that the metal ties in with the red bone color. Stormhost Silver is up next, and we're just going to use this to pop out some of the edge highlights of the metal. Not everywhere. I actually don't like to do this on every single edge because I think it looks overdone. Just some areas where you want that trim to look sharper. So I would focus that on things like this, where like the inside of the collar where the head's poking out. Just helps frame that head a little bit. These little hinges here, the tips of spikes, the very corners of some of the trim, the edge of a knife, like a plague knife or something like that. Anything that you want to draw attention to. So think about that. If you don't want to draw attention to a certain area, don't overdo it. Remember that this metal is rusty. It should really be coated in rust all over the place. So any kind of area where it's shiny like this has been rubbed off or scratched or whatever. So definitely don't want to overdo it. Make sure if you're going to highlight the trim on the shoulder pads, to highlight both edges of the trim. But again, not all of it. Don't go all the way around. I always like to highlight this little bit on the guns, the little gun nozzle. And the metal is now finished. Part 8, Tentacles, Goggles and Slime. Let's rip into it. Let's begin with Ceramite White. And we're going to lay down a solid coat over all of the tentacles. Make sure you thin this down, get it nice and smooth. Sometimes Ceramite White, the paint gets a little bit gluggy or something. Like, I don't know, it starts separating. I've had a few of them and they all seem to do it. But fine, if you just thin it down and mix it up a little bit, make sure it's nice and smooth, she'll be right. We're going to switch to our finer brush and thin it down a little bit more than you normally would to begin painting the goggles just on the lenses. Be very careful with this. Paint a few little dots in poor little Frank's severed bit. And while it's out, we might as well just paint the plasma gun. We're going to paint the plasma itself later, but we've got it out now, so why not? Let's just paint it now so we don't have to paint it later. Make sure you get a nice solid coat of white over all these areas. For these bits of slime, where you don't want to paint the whole droplet, we want to focus this Ceramite White towards the bottom of each drop, and then we're going to blend it upwards, so sort of fade out that white. So start off first by just painting the bottom of each one, and then thin that paint right down, and start just creating a bit of a gradient towards the top of each droplet. Put a bit of Ceramite White into these little muzzle flash sections here, whatever they are, I don't know. We're just going to make that look like a bit of a glowing flash later on, so we're laying down some white there. This little bit of slime that I sculpted dribbling out of his foot, out of his greaves, we're just going to paint that white. That's dribbling down over the skulls. That was actually already part of the model. All I did was just extend that bit of slime so that it dribbles over the skulls and puts that model in the same environment as the skulls. Now we're going to get out the Waywatcher Green, and we're going to start building up this intense, disgusting, radioactive, toxic, slimy tentacle look that we're going for. It's going to start coming alive now with this really intense green. And with each tentacle, we want we want it to be more intense towards the bottom of each tentacle and lighter towards the tip. So it'll be almost white at the tip, but like a fluoro hardcore green at the base of each tip. So just lay down one coat over each tentacle, as well as these little bits that we painted in Frankie's severed bit in his neck. You can add a little bit around the outside of his neck too, just to blend it together. These little bits here on his forehead. Now we're going back to the tentacles, and we're going to focus a little bit closer towards the base of each tentacle and just start painting it down, getting closer and closer towards the base. We're going to do maybe 3 coats of this, I reckon. Each time you do a new Waywatcher coat, it gets a bit more intense. Now we're going to begin painting the goggles. And we're going Waywatcher Green here, and we just want to give a solid coat over each lens in the goggle. Now let's go ahead and do a second coat of Waywatcher Green on each lens in the goggles. You can direct it towards the top right hand corner. Now we're going to use Necrotite Green, which is a very intense paint. We're going to thin it right down with water and start glazing it over the goggles. On the lenses of the goggles, we're going to focus this about 90% of each lens heading towards the top right hand corner. Now we're going to use Drakenhof Nightshade, and again we're just going to glaze this on each lens heading towards the top right hand corner. We're going to paint about 50% of each lens. And the way lenses like this work, when the light is coming from the right, the lens is darker on the right. As the light passes through the lens, it passes through the bottom left and appears brighter at the bottom left, but there will be a shine in the top right in the middle of the dark areas. So we're just going to build up this dark area with a little bit more Drakenhof Nightshade, maybe 2 or 3 more coats, just getting closer and closer towards that top right hand corner, just edging a little bit closer. And now we're going to switch to Abaddon Black, and we're going to thin it right down, and we're just enhancing that top right hand corner a little bit more, just making it ever so slightly just darker and darker until it gets to a nice dark color. So we want it very dark in the top right hand corner of each lens and nice and bright in the bottom left hand corner where the light is passing through and refracting out of that side. Now we're bringing out Ceramite White. We're going to thin it right down, and we're going to paint a tiny little white dot in the top right hand corner of each lens, in the middle of the black area. For now, the lenses are finished. Now let's get into painting some slime. Back to Waywatcher Green here, just giving it a nice solid coat all over that slime. And we're going to paint these drops dripping off the plasma gun too. Just give it a nice solid coat of Waywatcher Green. And we're going to go ahead and give it another coat, a second coat, just to intensify it, brighten it up a little bit. Because I find that one coat of Waywatcher Green is never really enough. Now we're using Necrotite Green, thinned right down with water, and we're going to just begin glazing this up towards the tops of each drop. The theory behind each drop is essentially the same as the goggles. It's going to be darker in the top right hand corner and lighter in the bottom left corner of each drop, because we're trying to create something that's transparent where light is passing through. Same thing with the slime. The slime is a little bit more of a weird shape. It's a bit hard to interpret where the light would be, and I'm not a scientist of light or anything, so just do your best. Now we're going to brighten up those bottom left corners with Necrotite Green mixed with White Scar 50-50 or 1-to-1, and we're just going to glaze the bottom left corners of them of each drop. Just brighten them up a little bit. And same thing on the slime. Now we're using Drakenhof Nightshade to start pushing the gradients and darkening up that top right hand corner of each drop in the same way that we did the lenses. Just do a few coats, just edge it closer and closer as you get towards that dark corner. We're using a nice thin brush here, so we've got lots of control. We're not using a big fat brush soaked in this wash, because that would just flood out all over the place. Look at my brush, it's really small, really fine. It's not holding a lot of paint at all. It's just lightly glazing it. We're glazing, we're not washing here. Yeah, these little blobs like this are hard to interpret, but I just try to keep the same sort of theory: dark on the right, light on the left. Now we're using Abaddon Black, thinned right down with water, and we're just darkening up those drops right in the corner, just getting it dark. Just glazing it and just taking our time with that. Now we're just going back to Waywatcher Green, just toning it down a little bit, pulling those colours together. Somehow it got a little bit pasty looking and not as intense as I wanted, so just taking it back down to Waywatcher Green. Now this is really fun. We're using Ceramite White, and we're going to begin painting all of the little shines on the drops and making them look nice and wet and transparent. And each one of these dots has to be on the right hand side of each drop, preferably in the dark area in the top right hand corner, but you can add more dots if you want and give it like a more sparkly look. Just make sure that each one of those dots is directed towards the right hand side of each drop, or whichever side the light source is coming from. Make sure that the paint is thin down, but not too thin. I just find that it flows off the brush much easier. Especially for me, I live in Australia and it's bloody hot sometimes, and often the paint dries on the brush before it even touches the model. Like when you take the brush off the palette, it's dry before it even touches the model. So just make sure, if that's happening, just to make your paints a little bit wetter, and you'll be right. So you can see I'm adding a few extra little dots here just to make it look a little bit more sparkly and wet. Part 9, Plasma. Time to create some epic plasma. First thing we're going to do is we're going to coat the plasma coils in Waywatcher Green. Now, I have to admit here that I made a mistake. I don't know, but for whatever reason, I did not do a second coat of Ceramite White on the plasma coils before I started doing this. So I apologize. Make sure that when you do it, you've got a nice solid coat of Ceramite White before you start doing this, because you'll see that it just doesn't look right in a minute. And that, I don't know why I didn't realize, but I'll have to, I end up painting over it with Ceramite White and doing it properly. It is very important for this plasma effect to work that that first coat of Ceramite White is really pure. So this is what it should look like. We've redone the Ceramite White, made it nice and pure, and then we've added 2 coats of Waywatcher Green. Now we're using Necrotite Green, and we're thinning that down with water, and we're glazing it. We're focusing it on this top right hand corner of the plasma coils. We're just intensifying it and brightening it up. Just adding a little bit more here. We're focusing it in this corner. We want this corner to just appear just a little bit darker than the rest. And we want that bottom crease to be white. Later on, that's going to be pure white. Now we're mixing Necrotite Green with a tiny little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade, and we're just sort of running this along that edge, along that top edge that we want to just make it a little bit darker. You be very careful with this, don't go overboard with it. I go a little bit overboard with it here, but we neaten it up a little bit later. Now we're using Ceramite White, and we're just mixing that with water, man. And we're making that into a wash and flooding that into the bottom crease. So you just press your brush in there and just let the plasma coils soak it up. You're going to drink that Ceramite White wash. Then what we do here is we turn it upside down slightly and get your fine brush and just slightly start pulling that wash while it's still wet. Just start guiding it into the recesses of the plasma coils, just pulling it downwards, just guiding it into those recesses. Because the inside of each plasma coil needs to be white, it needs to be hot. Now we're just toning that down a little bit with Waywatcher Green, just going back and glazing it a little bit, pulling it towards the top, that top corner. Just making nice smooth transitions. At this point, we're going to clip off the model from the subsection wire, and we're going to glue it to the model because it's time to start creating some glow. However, before we can get stuck into the glow, we just need to tone down this plasma coil just a little bit. We're using Ceramite White thinned down with water into a glaze, and we're just enhancing this gradient that we've got on the top of the plasma coil. So we're pulling white towards the body, making it stronger on that corner edge, the outer edge of that plasma coil. So we're using white, and we're just creating a little bit more of a gradient here towards the Plague Marine's chest. Just a little bit lighter towards his chest. Now it's time to create the intense, crazy ass glow. We're using Necrotite Green here, and we're thinning it right down with water. I'm talking thin, man, like thin it. Super thin. It's like mostly water. It's 98% water and 2% paint. We're using a medium layer brush for this, and we're just glazing around the outside of the plasma coils. And this paint is so thin, you just have to be patient with this. This is how it works. We just build up the layers, directing the paint towards the source, the light source, which is the plasma coils. And we're just going to layer it up. We're just going to go layer over layer again and again, always getting closer and closer towards that plasma coil. Put some glow around these little muzzle flashes. And we can begin applying the glow to the chest. We're just going to start slapping it on here. I'm just going to rip into it. The paint is so thin, so we're just building up the layers. We just got to be patient. And so we're not just going to be putting this paint where the light touches. We're creating a glow here. We're not just creating OSL, where if you imagine a circle around the plasma coil itself, all of that area is what you want to paint. Even areas that you might think wouldn't actually be touching, wouldn't get touched by the light. Even if that means you're painting some of this glow into shadowed areas. I hope that makes sense, man. Like we're creating a glow as well as the light. Bits like this stud, that's very close to the plasma core. So obviously things like that are going to be more intense. They're going to have more of this green paint on them. We want to make sure we paint this part of his arm here where it's very close to the plasma coil, as well as the tentacles and these studs, and any other kind of scratches or details on his chest. We're going to pick that out as well. Just gradually going around, building up this glow, making it more intense the closer it is to the plasma coil, and sort of fading out the further away it gets. See, an area like this here, it's pretty impossible for the light to actually be touching that bit behind that little gold cylinder bit behind the coil. But if we didn't paint that, if we didn't paint glow on that, there would be this whole glowing effect, except for that little bit. It would just look strange. You'd lose the glowing effect. You've got all the lighting right, but we're not just creating lighting here. We're trying to create glow. So again, we're using Necrotite Green here, where it's thinned right down with water. It's very thin. We're just going around this plasma, just building up the layers, making it glowing and making it hot, making it more intense the closer it is to the plasma coil. We're going to start introducing a bit of this glow on his face here, like the underside of his lips, the bottom side of his flabby bits. Highlight a little bit of the maggots. They'll be glowing a little bit as well. Go ahead and pop out the underside of this metal trim here with a bit of green. You can see that sort of comes alive when you start adding a bit of lighting to that. We're going to add a little bit under the cheeks. We're actually adding a little bit of a glow around his goggles here. Now I'm very careful not to overdo this. We don't want to create too much glow happening. We'll lose the effect. If you have too much of something, it just stops being cool. So we're going to keep that in mind when we're doing this glow around his eyes. We're just going to make it a little bit subtle, just to enhance that kind of toxic look of his eye goggles without taking away from the plasma. We're just stippling it and glazing it, just ripping into it, just making some mad glow. Making the bottom of his face a little bit greener, because if your face was this close to a plasma gun, it's going to be glowing. I definitely don't want to make it glowing too much though. We don't want to overdo it. And we're going to whack a bit more green glowing over here on this shoulder pad and this side of his chest. And just going to add a little bit to his fingertips here. That's enhancing that glow. So this is the theory. You need to have the source. It needs to be so pure. So we've got that intense green plasma coil with the white, the pure white in the bottom crease, surrounded by this intense but really thin paint that we're glazing all around it. That's the combination, man. That's how it works. You have the pure, hot source surrounded by intense glow. Home stretch, part 10, base and final touches. We're just going to start with some Abaddon Black, thin down with a little bit of water, not too much, and we're just going to do one coat around the rim of the base. We're going to come back to it later and do another coat, but for now we're just going to do one. Now we're just going to begin pretty much dry brushing Leadbelcher over the base. I say dry brushing, but it's not really. It's pretty messy. It's like the laziest dry brushing you've ever seen. I just don't even care, man. I just start flicking it all over the base. Try not to get it on the actual nicely painted stuff that we've done. Just whack it all over. Sort of dry brush it. Sort of just paint it. Whatever. We're putting it all over the texture of the base. All over the dirt. Everything. Next we're getting some Typhus Corrosion. And we're going to dunk our brush in it and start drowning the base in this stuff. Like heaps of it. Just don't be sparing with this at all. We want this to look like mud. So we're being very liberal with it. Just putting it all over the base. Everything that everywhere where we painted that Leadbelcher. It's just going to look like mud. We're not even going to dry brush this or anything. Once this Typhus Corrosion has gone on, that's it. That's the base. You can't put enough of this stuff on. Just slap it all over it. Heaps. Next we're going to go and get some foam that we've got out of a blister pack or something. Or you can use some sponge from the kitchen, whatever. I don't really care. Just rip a piece off like this and then break the ends off so it looks a little bit rough and random. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to dip this into some Typhus Corrosion. We're going to start lightly dabbing it onto the bottom of the cloth. And this is just going to create a bit of a muddy effect, like this guy's been running through a muddy battlefield, whatever, like it's been flicking up on him, the mud's flicking up on him. It just ties the model to the base, the miniature to the environment in which he's standing. Otherwise he's just this clean plague marine standing in a muddy environment. I just like to do a little thing like this on my miniatures, and I don't go overboard with it. Just be subtle. going back to Abaddon Black just to touch up that base, that rim of the base. This is the second coat, just nice and thin. We're just tidying up. Now we're doing some touch-ups. We're going to mix some Necrotite Green with White Scar 1:1, and we're just going to go and pop out some of those very, very sharp highlights of the plasma glow. And we definitely don't want to go overboard here. This is a very subtle thing that we're just going to pick the very highlights, like the tip of this little spike here, just the very tip. Look at that. That's it. Highlight the edge of the gun casing here. Now we're going to use some Screaming Skull just to highlight the maggots, which we forgot to do earlier. I'm just going to pick out some of those little raised ridges on the maggots. Now we need to seal the model, and we're going to use the Army Painter Anti-Shine. Shake it up good and give it a nice solid coat, but not too much. Don't go overboard with it. Now we're going to use some Nurgles Rot, and we're going to paint this over the slime on the base, as well as a little bit on the drips, but not too much on the drips. You can see I got a little bit of Nurgles Rot on the cloth there, and I just switched to my brush, which I have on standby if I make a boo-boo. And I just wiped it off, and there's no harm done. Easy. So when you're coating this slime, I like to do 2 coats of this rather than one big fat dirty coat. It just makes the slime look a little bit more transparent and gooey, and we can still see all of that nice blending that we've spent hours doing. Now we're going to wipe most of it off the brush, just on onto the thumb there, and we're going to just direct a little bit of this Nurgles Rot into the bases of each of the tentacles, just to make them look a little bit more yellowy and a little bit more sickly. Now let's crack out the Ard Coat, and we're going to use this to just paint over all of the drops and all of the slime, anything that you want to be shiny. We'll put a little bit on the goggles, on the lenses. Don't put too much, and don't put this on the plasma coils. It'll kind of ruin the effect. Definitely don't put it on the plasma coils. Whack a bit on the little maggots here. A little bit in his mouth, just to make him look like he's got a bit of saliva or drool or whatever. Just a little bit, adds a little bit of interest. We're going to switch to our larger brush, and we're just going to dunk it in the Ard Coat, and we're just going to put a few little puddles on the base here. Not too much, just a little bit, just to make it look like the mud's a little bit wet, like there's a few little puddles and things like that. And would you believe it? With that, the model is finished. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching it. Bloody legends. I hope you'll stick around for next month's painting tutorial by Mezgike. It's going to be a night haunt. Hooroo.